In this video, I'm going to take you guys through making binding for our quilts. So we should have our quilt tops finished or almost finished. And so now we'll start preparing them for quilting and a completed quilt. So first of all, I have my binding fabric right here. I'm just going to go ahead and press out the wrinkles real quick. Okay, and then from this fabric, we will just cut 2.5-inch strips because we are going to make a 2.5-inch double fold binding. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut all of my strips from this piece of binding fabric. Okay. So now that we have our strips, we will sew all of our strips together to make one long strip. And there are two different ways you can do that. So the first way is pretty simple. So you'll have your two strips and you will just put them together, right sides together, and sew a straight line. Or you can do it on a bias seam. I don't know if it's called a bias seam. There's probably a more proper term for it. But on this seam, it will distribute the bulk of your seam on the edge of your quilt. So it's kind of a nice way to bind quilts, and it's my preference to do it that way. So then you will attach your strips by putting them at a 90-degree angle on top of one on top of the other. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin these in place so they don't move on me. And then we are going to end up sewing from this corner to this corner. So you can mark on that diagonal line or use the seam tape like you do for a half square triangle. So I tend to use a seam tape on my machine, but this is what we're doing. We're going to sew on that diagonal right there. So now that we have the marked line, we'll just go ahead and sew on the marked line. And then you end up with a nice diagonal seam, and that will help distribute the weight or the bulk of the seam in your binding pieces. Okay, so we have the first two attached. We'll keep attaching all of our strips until we have one long strip. We'll keep adding these strips on one by one, and then instead of marking it, so you can go ahead and you can draw your line from corner to corner and sew that way, or we can use the seam tape. So I lined the seam tape up. The red line is lined up with my needle, and then I can just use this tape as a guide. You can use any tape. It doesn't even have to be the seam tape. So I'm going to start my needle in this corner, and then I want to end it in this corner right here. So I'm going to keep that lined up with the red line as I sew. And then we can also just start adding the next one. So you always want to make sure you're putting them on the right way though. So you're going to have right side up. And then I'll grab the next strip. And you want right side down. And so we're going to put them at a sharp 90-degree angle, and you can pin or you can hold. And if this part confuses you, just go ahead, break the thread, just make sure you're putting these on the right direction. Okay, and we'll do it again. So for whatever reason, I really struggled with this as a newer quilter. I end up with one of them on the wrong way all the time. And if that happens, no big deal, just pick your seam and do it again. Okay, so I have all of my strips sewn together. I'll go ahead and break these threads. And now I have one long strip of binding. And so you can do these diagonal seams to help distribute your bulk, or you can just do a simple straight seam. Either way will work. In fact, a lot of times I'll use a simple straight seam for like a stripe. But generally, if it's not a stripe, I'll go ahead and do that angled seam. Okay, so the next thing is we want to cut, or we want to trim off our extra fabric here. And we'll trim a 1/4 inch past that sewn line, just like most things in quilting. And then I'll take those little corner pieces off. And then we will press our binding into a double fold binding. You don't even have to use a ruler on these, just because they don't have to be exact necessarily. You just want to keep it around a 1/4 inch. Okay, now that we have this all stitched together in one long strip, we'll go ahead and press. So the first thing I'm going to do is press my seams open. So I like to press open to just help distribute the seam even more. So I'm just going to go through real quick and press each of these open. You can press to the side, that would be fine. I just like that it distributes that seam a little bit. Okay, now that all of our seams are pressed open, we'll do a double fold. So it's a simple fold over, wrong sides together. And we will just start folding and pressing this entire long strip. When you get to a seam, just make sure the seam is laying flat in the right directions. Nothing gets flipped. Alright, final little fold of our binding right at the end. So now we have all of our binding folded and ready to sew it onto our quilts. So this is actually the last step of our quilt making process, but now we are ready for when we get there.